Most people who applied for a PPP loan have received it at this point. If you haven't, you're probably working with the wrong bank. So we'd recommend going through like a smaller SBA lender like a Blue Vine or a Lendio or a Cabbage, and the funds are still available.
You're listening to the Legal Mastermind podcast with your hosts Ryan Klein and Chase Williams, the go-to podcast for learning from the experts in the legal community about effective ways to grow and manage your law firm.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Legal Mastermind podcast. I'm here with my co-host, Ryan Klein, and today we'll be speaking with Brian Basinger of Basinger CPA. Brian helps business owners all over the country navigate the complex world of accounting, bookkeeping, and tax preparation. And Brian, you put together some really great guides and material on PPP loans so far. And I know the topic on everybody's mind right now is the forgiveness of those loans. So today we'll be diving into the recent updates of forgiveness and what your firm needs to do to prepare. Welcome to the Legal Mastermind podcast, Brian.
Thanks, Chase. Thanks, Ryan.
Yeah. So I guess starting off, really just tell us a little bit more about Basinger CPA and what you do.
Right. So Basinger CPA, we're a strategic advisory firm. We try and go really in depth and also be extra proactive in helping our clients to focus on tax planning and accounting and cash flow forecasting so that they're thinking ahead both on the tax world and on their finances.
Awesome. So those that don't know what a PPP loan is, do you want to, hopefully most lawyers and business owners do know what this PPP loan is, and hopefully they're utilizing it if they're able to. Do you want to give us some background on the loan and kind of the history? And obviously it came about due to COVID, but as far as like the application process and how that goes.
Yeah, I mean, I think most people understand what the PPP loan is, but just as a quick background for it, as COVID hit the United States in March and the shutdown became necessary, the federal government decided that there was some relief necessary, and they came out with the CARES Act, among a few other acts, but the CARES Act was what ultimately gave birth to the PPP loan. And the intention is simply to give relief to businesses, specifically small businesses, which would be, most law firms. And it is not the only option out there under the CARES Act. And that's an important point and something we can talk on here a little bit more later. But the PPP loan itself is basically designed to cover at least 2 months worth of payroll, along with some other expenses like rent and utilities or mortgage interest.
So as far as applying for it, just to lead up to the point where we're going to, of course, be talking about the forgiveness, but I know that the first round went through very quickly. We got our own loan in the second round, and then I kind of forgot about it then because I know I have a bad habit of being like, well, I got it, so I'm not really thinking too much about who else is not getting in right now. So how many rounds did it get to, and are they still approving loans today?
Yeah, we're still in the second round. And it seems like most of the larger companies honestly got some preferential treatment in the first round, which there was then some outrage after that. And, some of that was pretty public, but basically banks were taking care of larger customers first in the first round, which is why it went through so quickly, the appropriated funds. And the second round now is down to, it's truly the small businesses, and most people who applied for a PPP loan have received it at this point. If you haven't, you're probably working with the wrong bank. So we'd recommend going through like a smaller SBA lender like a Blue Vine or a Lendio or a Cabbage, and the funds are still available.
And it's interesting you mentioned that too, because Chase and I were also considering doing the application through multiple places after we felt like Chase Bank wasn't really upholding its responsibility for processing the loans of small to medium-sized businesses. So do people really know that you could potentially have multiple applications out at any given time?
I think that at least based on our client base and the clients with whom we're speaking, most people have at this point, even some of the larger banks have come around and started actually processing those loans. But if you haven't and you're waiting on a big bank, then you could probably just ditch them and again go to one of the smaller lenders that I mentioned. Or community banks have been really great at getting those loans out very quickly. So a community bank or a credit union, that's an approved SBA lender. If you don't have it yet and you want it, go to one of those smaller banks, and a lot of times they're getting those loans turned around very quickly, like within a day or two.
So not to dive too far away from the PPP loan, but I know you briefly mentioned for those not eligible for a PPP loan, what are some other options briefly?
So the other option, which was up until last week mutually exclusive with the PPP loan, was payroll tax deferral. So you can defer the Social Security portion of payroll tax, the employer portion. So that's 6.2% of of the wages that you pay out that you're normally remitting to the government, essentially in line with your payroll, different requirements based on the size of your payroll. But essentially, you can take that tax for 2020 and defer it and repay half of it in 2021 and the other half in 2022. So you can defer it out 2 years. It's essentially an interest-free loan, and with a 0% interest rate. So it's a good deal. A lot of people aren't as interested in it simply because they don't want to have to worry about the extra cash flow burden in future years. But if you're struggling and looking for places to improve your cash flow, it's a loan on phenomenal terms is essentially the way to think about it.
So I guess really diving into what everybody's here for is that forgiveness of the PPP loan. And I know there's a lot of changes that had just happened, I guess, a couple of days ago.
And actually, Chase, there are a couple other things that I wanted to mention that I should have done right then, which is
sure.
There are two other items that law firms should consider if they're looking for financial relief and for whatever reason they're not eligible for the PPP loan, or even in some cases if they are eligible for the PPP loan. One of those is the economic injury disaster loan, which actually at this point, if they haven't applied for it, unfortunately, the application process is closed. But a lot of those applications are being processed now. And so I would expect that if people got in applications early, that they'll start to see the approvals come through for those loans in the next couple of weeks. And that's something definitely to consider. Even if the PPP loan sort of covered the immediate cash flow need, the EIDL, economic injury disaster loans, are coming through now. Generally, they're for anywhere between $25,000 and $150,000. And they're not free money, but they're money on really good terms. And the second thing is there is also a payroll tax credit available for employees who have missed time due to COVID, or if their families were affected by COVID and they had to miss time. So there are other options out there, basically, for people who either did or didn't get the PPP loan, basically to relieve cash flow.
So diving into what a majority of people I think are listening to the podcast for is the forgiveness of these PPP loans. I know a lot of changes came within the past week as far as percentages go and what you can spend the money on versus what you can't spend the money on. I know this is a pretty comprehensive question. So let's say somebody's, a firm's got this PPP loan. What's the first steps that they need to take in documenting all the money they're spending in order to get the forgiveness?
I think the first steps would be to basically run through the math and document out how much you're going to spend in payroll over the next 24 weeks now. It was 8 weeks up until last week, and now it's been extended to 24 weeks. So document how much you're going to spend in payroll over the next 24 weeks. That does include guaranteed payments for law firm partners, or if they're paid via salary, it would include their salary. But there is a limitation on the forgiveness specifically for partner salaries and guaranteed payments, which is that it can't go up over what it was last year. So whatever 24.50 seconds, basically the same prorated amount of last year's guaranteed payments was, that's what it needs to be again for this year in order to be forgiven. And for all the other employees, it's just a matter of mapping out how much you're going to pay out over the next 24 weeks. For most people and most law firms, that payroll now is going to be enough in and of itself to cover the PPP loan and to allow it to be totally forgiven. But if it's not, or if you want to go for a shorter period and try and get it done within the 8 weeks, you can add in either your rent and utilities or mortgage interest if you own the building and utilities. And you basically sum up those amounts. We're talking wages only, not payroll taxes, at least federal payroll taxes. And you can include other things like employer-sponsored health insurance costs and retirement contributions. But again, for most of our clients, what we're seeing is now that the period is opened up to 24 weeks, you don't have to get too nitty-gritty about getting into the details. It's more that there's more than enough cost within the 24 weeks to cover people's PPP loans.
For anyone that's listening, just to clarify, there aren't PPP loans that are going out to cover expenses for 24 weeks. It's still 8 weeks. You just can use whatever happens for the duration of 24 weeks for that loan.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
So the PPP loan is still calculated based on the 2.5 times multiplier of last year's payroll. So basically the idea is to cover about 2.5 months of payroll. And then you had only 2 months to use it, which was creating some stress in there. And that's where you needed to supplement with rent and utilities and other things like that. And you still may choose to, but yeah, because there's now that differential there of 2.5 months of going into calculating the Paycheck Protection Program loan versus 24 weeks to use it up, or a full 6 months, most people are having no problem at all spending enough to justify full forgiveness.
That makes sense. I can understand that. Have you been hearing anything about like the SBA doing additional loans at this point? Is there any talks to doing another round if it's necessary, or allowing loans to people that may go through their initial loan and need more financial cushion?
I haven't heard anything serious about that. There have been there's some sort of rumors flying around, but I haven't heard anything serious about it. The main focus now seems to be on making sure that the Paycheck Protection Program actually does work for most people, which it wasn't before, and they've really fixed a lot of that.
So what could those businesses do that possibly laid off some of their staff and they're not in a position to hire them again, but they still want that forgiveness? Or let's say they need to lay somebody off, but they don't want to lay someone off because they're worried they won't get their loan forgiveness now.
Well, those are kind of two inverse scenarios. In the first case, if somebody laid off employees and is now worried about not getting the Paycheck Protection Program forgiveness because they had laid off that employee previously, they had, under the old rules, only until June 30th to essentially hire everybody back. And if you couldn't hire back the specific person, you could basically make an equivalent job offer to someone else. And that timeline has now extended. So you have until December 31st to hire back any employees who are furloughed or paid off. Or if you reduced wages, either hourly wages or salary, you have until December 31st to restore those wage rates. Now, in the second scenario where somebody might be needing to lay someone off and is concerned about not getting forgiveness, for that, I would actually encourage them to try and apply for the 8-week forgiveness, which is still available, and basically wrap up the forgiveness and then go ahead and proceed with the layoff. Or better still would be if we're not actually talking about laying someone off, but are letting them go with cause, you can let someone go with cause that has been deemed an appropriate exclusion to the headcount rule.
It's been my understanding kind of when this started, and especially talking to other agency owners and businesses that really were already pre-COVID hiring a lot of remote people, a lot of consultants and whatnot, that 1099s weren't really covered. This is mostly like W-2, like hired employees to be eligible for that loan. Was that the case?
Yes, that is the case. This is intended for employees, W-2 employees, not for contractors. And the idea there is basically that contractors are eligible to go and get their own PPP loans. So they're not letting businesses stack those and basically get a PPP loan for contractors who can then also go get their own PPP loan.
Okay. So yeah, the reason I kind of mentioned that is just because I guess the landscape of employment, as it moves forward with a lot of people getting used to remote work, and then that going hand in hand with a lot of times where people are consultants or freelancers, and just that typically seem to be the arrangement. You're remote, you may be more of a 1099. Do you think that's something businesses have to consider for the future?
That's a great question. That it's tough to speculate on where things are going to be in the future. However, I would say that you can still hire employees. I think the danger with contractors is always going to be the same, which is that even if somebody is working remotely and in a different state, if they are not able to do things like set their own hours and use their own equipment, and a lot of times if they don't even have multiple clients and are really not operating as their own, sometimes certain states in particular are fairly aggressive about coming after employees and saying, hey, you're paying this person as a contractor, but we think they're an employee. So there's just always something to factor in, not necessarily related to PPP, but just in general when thinking about contractor versus employee.
Yeah, we had somebody come into our office in Fort Lauderdale and literally knock on the door and ask, are you all W-2 employees? And luckily they were, which is pretty crazy. And then we actually got in trouble for not having like one of the signs you're supposed to print out. It has been fixed. We have the signs now, but it's funny because they just randomly did an audit. And then luckily we were, and when we first started our business, we had a lot of contractors, but we've been trying to, take care of our employees and pay them as W-2 benefits and all that. So.
And this is just one of those moments where the people who were sort of doing that and hiring traditional employees and paying the payroll taxes, et cetera, were really rewarded by being able to take advantage of the PPP loan.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering if people will kind of like change the makeup of how they hire and how they pursue people. Because we were 90% pretty much employees at that point. And so we only had a couple of contractors, when this all got rolling. And then, I remember that sign. It was a workers' comp sign. So they had to make sure it had workers' comp, for people that don't stress their wrists too much, typing several hours a day.
No carpal tunnel.
Yeah. So as far as kind of like the standards for forgiveness, I mean, this whole thing since it started was, so I don't know, to sum it up, seemed like a mess when it started. It was like there were guidelines set up by like the SBA, but then all these banks were doing it their own way and they had their own process and no one really knew what was going on. So now when it's like the forgiveness rules, then it's like, I don't think that banks or whoever's supplying these loans have their own process. There have to be like concrete guidelines. So where are like the definitive guidelines for the forgiveness located?
The SBA has released a series of frequently asked question documents, and that is currently the most authoritative interpretation of the bill and the legalities as of right now. So we still have many unanswered questions in terms of forgiveness. I expect actually that the SBA within the next few days will be releasing an additional FAQ document, but those FAQ documents from the SBA are currently the best source of information. They also released a actual forgiveness application, which is what the banks are supposed to be using, but that is now dated because it was all centered around this 8-week forgiveness period, which is now a 24-week forgiveness period. So there are going to be some changes to that. But in short, if legal firms are looking to apply for PPP forgiveness, they will do that through the bank, which issued their PPP loan. And the bank should have some essentially modified forgiveness template that they can use, which will be based on the SBA's template. And it's a question of going through, filling out all that numbers, going through the math, and putting together the forgiveness application with the supporting documentation that's required.
In that case, would the bank be using its discretion or its own team to approve or deny, or does that move along to the SBA at that point? Or is that going to be a future FAQ?
The banks are using their discretion at this point. So it's the bank's job to collect the forgiveness applications from the applicants and then make a forgiveness decision. And they have 90 days to make that forgiveness decision. And then the banks will take that forgiveness essentially decision and forward it on to the SBA, and then the SBA will ultimately forgive the banks. So it's a process. But from the recipient of the PPP loan, they will interact directly with the bank, and the bank will be the one making the decision on their forgiveness.
So do you think it's a good decision to apply for the forgiveness as soon as you've basically hit the spend for your loan in wages, or do you wait?
That's another great question. It's one of the unanswered questions from the SBA right now. It's clear that you can either choose a 24 or 8-week period, but it's not clear if you can go, say, 10 weeks or 12 weeks and then decide, okay, I've used everything I can, and then submit the forgiveness application. It's assumed right now, and we're just waiting for the SBA to confirm it, that will be an option, so that after, whenever you hit that threshold and you say, okay, we have spent everything that we can, we're ready to submit for forgiveness, and there's no benefit to waiting, that you'll be able to submit the application right then. That's just not 100% confirmed yet.
So we're getting up on that 2-month period where the first was actually distributed, correct?
Yes, correct. Our first clients who received their PPP loans actually hit their 8 weeks on Friday. So I don't think they were the absolute first, but yeah, that's the 8 weeks for the sort of the early tip of the PPP loans are expiring right now.
So I know a lot of business owners are curious to know as soon as the forgiveness, if they have it or not. So
yeah, I think every business is sort of in their own situation. We have a lot of clients who were right up against it, where they maybe were getting 90% forgiveness and they just couldn't squeeze out that last little bit within the guidelines that had been given. And so, we'll wait. And if we have to go the full 24 weeks, we will. But, we're hoping that we can go maybe 9 or 10 or 11 weeks and finish out the PPP loan and then submit for the forgiveness.
So something interesting you just mentioned is, having that 90% forgiveness. So it's not either 0% or 100% forgiveness. There's a sliding scale.
Sure, absolutely. The main cause for lack of forgiveness is simply not enough payroll, that we're seeing, and because there were limits on the amount of non-payroll expenses you can only have 25% of the loan be for non-payroll purposes. So we had clients who just simply didn't have enough payroll to justify the full forgiveness. And so for those clients in particular, this 24-week period is crucial for two reasons. One is that the extra time will allow them to have enough payroll, but also they moved that line from 75% payroll costs to 60% payroll costs. So they've opened up a lot more possibility to get forgiveness for rent, utilities, and or mortgage interest if that's making up a substantial amount of the expenditures.
And then as far as proving the expenses or showing the expenses, I know that we mentioned documentation. What are businesses typically just doing? What's like the most simple way that they're providing this information?
So a lot of payroll providers have Paycheck Protection Program reports that are already canned that they've come out with, where you can sort of run that report and get your own numbers. They'll hand you kind of on a platter your payroll costs, your state and local taxes, your retirement contribution costs, and your group health insurance costs, if applicable. And so it would be taking that report, running it for the appropriate dates, and then plugging those numbers into the Paycheck Protection Program application form. And then, if appropriate, you might want to print out that report, print out any supporting documentation, and put that together in a packet for your bank. Most banks have not come out yet with their own application yet, but we do have the SBA's application. And so it'd be just, at this point, gathering as many documents as possible so that when it comes time to submit the forgiveness application, you have everything at hand to be able to just submit it to your bank.
And then I know that our listeners would never do anything unethical and not smudge numbers or try to embellish anything. So are there any ways that anyone sending this information, you would advise them to do it properly? There's any ways that people might do it that might raise a red flag, even if they don't mean to, that might compromise their forgiveness?
Yeah, I think probably the two most common errors that somebody could make is inadvertently including all payroll costs instead of just the named payroll costs, and with federal payroll taxes being the main one. So don't accidentally include everything that you pay out for payroll, including wages and taxes. Only, maybe 3% of the total that you pay out in taxes is actually forgivable. It's just your state and local taxes. And then the second one is that I was talking earlier about the owner's compensation, and you can't basically overpay yourself. You can't just fill in the gap that you need to cover the rest of your forgiveness by paying yourself. It's capped based on what you paid yourself in the prior year.
Interesting. So no cash advances, no bonuses at this time?
Actually, you can do bonuses and cash advances, just not for yourself. You can't do it you can't do it for the owners of the firm. You can do it for employees. And that was a more popular strategy under the 8-week guidelines than it is under the 24 weeks. Again, with 24 weeks, it's not very often necessary to do that. Most people can just sort of organically cover the expenses.
Okay. So you did see some situations where owners were looking, they're saying, we're probably not going to hit in 8 weeks, so let's pay a few people in advance for a couple of weeks and then just tell them then a little later on you won't get paid for 2 weeks. That was kind of an arrangement happening.
Right, which is a perfectly legal and okay arrangement. Yeah, we had a couple of clients who basically said, "Hey, we're going to pay you as much as we can pay you during this 8 weeks, and then the rest of your year we'll net that amount out of and spread it across the rest of the year." Yeah. And the employees were okay with it, and they did it, and then it ended up being unnecessary. But of course, they are now in a spot where they can submit their full forgiveness application in 8 weeks instead of having to do it. Didn't end up being necessary, but there still is some ancillary benefit.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. It's not one of those like you want $1 now or $2 later. It's just you want $1 now or $1 later. So I suppose most people would want to do the same thing.
Just to sort of proactively say a couple things here, the main things that people need to keep in mind in regards to the PPP program now, especially with this new change, is first, this opening up of payroll tax deferral was totally off the table if you got a PPP loan previously, and now it's on the table. And so there's this whole basically new source of funding available to business owners who received PPP funds that was not available before. So if you find yourself still in a spot where cash flow is looking tight, or even if it's not looking tight and you're just trying to acquire as much working capital as possible, deferral of payroll tax for 2020 is now a very legitimate option to basically get a 0% interest loan that has to be paid back over the next 2 years. The last point that I wanted to make is just that the PPP program is one item out of many. Like, the PPP program won't make or break your law firm. It is something that is intended to be an assistance to your law firm. But what we're finding is that the whole COVID situation is sort of shining a light on the fact that a lot of businesses don't have great control over their balance sheet. They don't have a long-term cash flow plan. And that is probably the bigger item to consider for firm owners, is if the PPP loan, if you did or didn't get the PPP loan, regardless, you need to have a long-term cash flow plan for your firm and be thinking long-term, be forecasting out, and have a solid balance sheet in place, even on top of the PPP loan. So the PPP loan is a Band-Aid, but for the overall health of the firm, it should be standard practice to have a long-term cash plan in place, and the PPP loan should be one element that figures into that.
And Brian, you can help out with this forecasting, PPP loan forgiveness, and then also tax preparation for firms. If any of our listeners are looking for guidance or possibly to work with you, what's the best way to reach out?
You can reach out to me directly via email. It's Brian, Brian, at BasingerCPA.com, or you can find us online and reach out that way.
Thanks for listening to the Legal Mastermind podcast. If you're interested in working with Ryan and Chase, please email mastermind@marketmymarket.com. Make sure to join the free mastermind group for growing and managing your firm at lawfirmmastermind.com. Ryan Klein and Chase Williams are the managing partners at Market My Market, one of the top legal marketing companies in the United States.